And once again, our cameraman Jim is behaving extremely badly.
It's the water buffalo.
It
is.
Oh God, I could talk for hours about it. I love these bikes. But once again, here we are at the Jameson Classic Motorcycle Museum in Pacific Grove, California. The museum is closed. We live in COVID days. However, I got a key. And so we've opened up the museum especially to do a couple of episodes of Misfits. And I'm so looking forward to this next one, Liza.
So you are always going on and on about your beloved water buffalo. And here it is.
Oh, I love these things so much.
So I wanted to talk about the water buffalo, why this bike is significant, what's so special about it, and why they stopped making them.
Okay, well, let's do a bit of history about the water buffalo. What makes the water buffalo so special? It's a product of its time. And because it's a product of its time, we're never going to see its like again. So a lot of us ride motorcycles for the thrill, a lot of us ride for the speed, a lot of us ride motorcycles because it's a nostalgic journey. And if you ride a vintage motorcycle, often you can get transported back to a time in your life or a period of time. It's very, very evocative of that. And the Water Buffalo is one of those bikes. So let's talk about what it is. You can see it's quite a physically large thing. It's a 750cc. It's actually 738cc. It's a 3-cylinder, 2-stroke, water-cooled bike. Here's the radiator with a large crash bar around the top to make it look even wider than it is. Suzuki were always very, very proud of the fact that this bike was water-cooled. So they wanted to make a feature of the radiator. So even from the earliest examples, and we'll talk a little bit about the history, the radiator was a focal point of the bike.
Emma, interesting fact about this bike.
Yeah.
When it came out in 1972,
yes,
it wasn't vintage.
No, it wasn't. Wow. That's true. And if we went back to 1972, Jameson Classic Motorcycle Museum would have been filled with very different bikes than they are now. You know, it's difficult to believe that that's 48 years ago. It's wild. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the Water Buffalo. It was introduced in 1972 as the J model. This bike, even though it was a relatively short production run, from 1972 to 1978, just 6 years, it was constantly updated through its production run. So we'll go through some of the models and some of the detailed changes between them. So 1972 saw the introduction. The biggest thing you'd notice on the very first model years, it had a drum front brake. Now this one's got twin discs, but the earliest ones had a drum front brake. They're quite sought after, but in truth that was a terrible brake. It was awful, which is why it only lasted really half a year. Suzuki replaced it with twin discs very, very soon afterwards. Colour schemes were different. The first model year came in a fuchsia or a blue. Very, very wild, bright colours. 1973, it became the K model. Really, that was just paintwork changes. They toned down the colour scheme a bit, came in gold or red, white and blue. 1974 was the L, and that's what you're looking at here. The L came in 2 colours, candy flake orange or candy flake blue with silver lining. This is the rarest of them all, and a lot of the parts on the 1974 L are 1 year only parts. Now that's true of a lot of the other bikes, you know, the 1972 had the 1 year only drum brake. But in terms of volume of 1 year only parts, this makes this bike quite special. And when I built this bike, 15 years ago, it was a very deliberate choice. I wanted to build a 74 for that reason.
So in 1972, when these came out, what else was on the market?
Well, you could buy a 750 Honda, and that had already been out for 3 years. That was the groundbreaking bike. That was the four-cylinder, single overhead cam bike that really changed motorcycling as we know it. You could buy one of those, and in 1972 it was already the K2. It'd been through a couple of derivatives since the very earliest one, so it was an improved product. You could buy a Yamaha XS650. Back then it was called the XS1, or the XS2 had just come out in 1972. Really referred to as the Japanese Bonneville. It was a 650cc twin-cylinder bike. Very robust bike, very reliable. They always pitched, this is the oil-type Bonneville. But a four-stroke bike, as was the 750 Honda.
Yes.
Now, let's talk about the exciting bikes. The two-strokes. So as well as the 750, Suzuki actually brought out a range of bikes. There were the twin-cylinder bikes, which was the 125, the 185, the 250, and the 350, which was really a 305. But then they had a range of three-cylinder bikes, and these were the flagship bikes. The smallest was the 380, the middle one was the 550, and then the biggest was the 750 with water cooling. Incidentally, hence the name.
I was going to ask, why is it called a water buffalo?
Well, Suzuki wanted to make a feature of that radiator. We talked about that earlier. So the fact that it was water cooled was always very, very prominent. The earliest bikes had water cooled in big letters on the side panel as well. Now, it's a big bike, and to some eyes, it's not the best looking bike. I personally think they're beautiful, but some people thought they were kind of ugly, like a big old buffalo, hence water buffalo. But this bike went by many, many names. In England, they were known as the kettle, for the same reason, it boiled water. So, a lot of nicknames applied to this machine.
So, as a two-stroke, we know two-strokes go like a bat out of hell.
Yes, when you get them in the power band.
A two-stroke triple, this has got to be a beast.
Well, it is and it isn't. The focus with this bike, as opposed to the Kawasaki triples. Now let's talk about the Kawasaki triples. The Kawasaki 500 triple, the H1 Mark III, came out in 1969, and it was a very, very different bike to the Honda 750. It was actually faster than the Honda 750, but in terms of success, it was never as mainstream because it was a lot harder to ride. It had a razor-sharp power band. I mean, it literally was gutless until the power came in at 6,000 RPM. And then you got 60 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a great deal now, but when the 60 horsepower comes in like that, you could stand the bike on its rear wheel first, second, third, and fourth if you were a good enough rider. And of course, it caught a lot of people out. Add to the fact that they weren't the best handling bikes, and it really made for either an expert or a loony's bike. The 754 was always a lot better mannered. Now, in 1972, Kawasaki brought out an even bigger version of the H1, the H2, which was the 750 version. The reality was the tuning was a little softer than on the 500. So even though H2 owners will always say, oh, this is the fastest bike on the road, when they were new in 72, 73 and 74, when GTs and H2s were sold alongside one another, they were very, very close in terms of performance. Wow. The focus on this bike, remember, it's in the name, it's written on the box. GT, Grand Touring. These are a little bit bigger than the Kawasaki's. They're a little bit heavier. They're more of a long distance bike. It's a more comfortable place to be. It's a lot more civilized to ride. And so they tuned it a little softer. This bike is unique because it's a two-stroke, but it has CV carburetors. And this is a very unusual thing on a two-stroke. A CV carburetor is a constant velocity or constant vacuum carburetor. And by their nature, two-strokes don't pull really enough vacuum to operate CV carbs correctly. The only reason the Water Buffalo got away with it was some very, very clever porting in the engine and just sheer mass of reciprocating movement inside, pulling the air through. It really made for quite a soft, civilized ride.
Okay, so water-cooled, triple, and it's a two-stroke. Sounds amazing.
Yes.
What killed the Water Buffalo?
Well, what killed them in the end was the EPA. And all the manufacturers knew it was coming. Honda had it made in the shade, of course, because they'd always focused on four strokes. Yamaha also focused on four strokes. Now, Kawasaki, they'd brought out the Z1 by now in 1973. Also, they had the Z650 planned for 1978. And the Z650 was a smaller version of the Z1. It was an across-the-frame 4, 650cc, and they pitched that as having the power of a 750. So they were set as well. Suzuki were left scrambling a little bit because they'd put all their R&D into the ill-fated RE5 rotary, which really didn't work out for them. So they had to scramble. And they came up with a range of four-cylinder, four-stroke bikes that had the mechanics of a two-stroke in the bottom end. The cranks were built like a two-stroke with roller bearings. It was really a stroke of genius. It cost them less to develop, and it made the engines bulletproof. And the GS550, the GS750, and later the GS1000 really became the benchmark for reliable, high-performance bikes.
So when did it finish?
Well, the very, very last GT750 was the B model. And the B model really was at the end of 1977 for a 1978 model. And that was it. It was done. A very, very short life, 6 years, which is really nothing. But they left a mark, and they left a big mark on people of my age and people like me who really genuinely love these things. They're dirty, they're smelly, they're way too fast for their chassis components, but there's just a charm to them that you simply don't get on a modern bike. And in my opinion, this is an extremely good looking bike. I love this period of motorcycling. I think this styling is uniquely Japanese. Bold styling, bold colors. It's just wonderful in every way.
Nice. Well, thank you very much for sharing the story of the Water Buffalo.
You are so welcome.
And if you would like to ask a question about any bike at all, because Emma knows everything, let's just face it.
Well, not quite, but...
We have not yet found a bike you don't know anything about, but if you would like to ask a question, you can send an email to askthemisfits, that's
MISSFITS
@gmail.com. We'll answer all your questions. We want to help you learn more about bikes, about the culture, about anything. So go ahead and send the questions out.
Knowledge is power, darling.
And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Yes, like and subscribe is very, very important so we can continue doing these videos, which I like doing if nothing else.
Exactly. So big thanks again to our guys Jim and Tad. Thank you very much. And big thanks
to Neil Jameson himself. Thanks for letting us use the museum again, Neil. Thank you.
And don't forget to go to motorcyclesandmisfits.com and check out our podcast as well.
For more motorcycle tomfoolery.
Exactly. I think we're ready to get out of here. Thanks, everyone.